For centuries, humanity has been asking one fundamental question: what happens when we die? Religion and philosophy have tried to answer this question, but science, rooted in the materialist assumption that the brain produces consciousness, has largely ignored it. After all, if consciousness is merely a function of neural activity, then death should bring an abrupt and total end to awareness. The brain stops, the lights go out, and that's the end of the story. Or is it? In the last few decades, something remarkable has happened. Science, yes, science, has begun to study what happens at the threshold of death. And the evidence is turning materialism on its head. Enter the near-death experience, or NDE. It's been called the ultimate anomaly, the crack in the wall of materialism that just won't go away. If materialism were correct, NDEs should be nothing more than the last gasps of a dying brain, random neural firings painting chaotic dreamscapes in the moments before oblivion. But that's not what happens. Over and over again, those who return from the brink of death don't describe confusion or hallucination. Instead, they tell of an experience more real than real life, a world more vivid, more coherent, and more profoundly meaningful than anything they had encountered before. For centuries, these experiences were brushed off as religious visions, hallucinations, or the products of an oxygen-starved brain. But today, we know better. Dutch cardiologist and NDE researcher Pim van Lommel has spent decades collecting data on this strange and persistent mystery. What he and others have uncovered has shaken the foundations of neuroscience. The traditional view is that the brain is the producer of consciousness. But after studying countless NDEs, van Lommel came to a conclusion that materialists find deeply unsettling. Until now, he said in the 2002 BBC documentary The Day I Died, the concept was that the brain is the producer of consciousness and the producer of memories, but when you study near-death experiences, you have to reconsider this concept. Perhaps we should consider the brain not as a producer, but as a receiver of consciousness, and that's a kind of revolution. A revolution indeed, because if consciousness doesn't originate in the brain, then it doesn't die with the brain either. If the brain is simply a receiver of consciousness, then death is merely a shift from one mode of existence to another. Consciousness goes on. And the implications are staggering. Again and again, people who are clinically dead return with vivid memories of another world. They describe floating above their bodies, moving through tunnels of light, meeting deceased loved ones, and undergoing life reviews where every moment of their existence is relived in astonishing detail. These reports, drawn from across cultures and spanning thousands of years, paint a strikingly consistent picture. Consciousness does not depend on the brain to exist. Near-death experiences have been reported for as long as humans have been able to record their thoughts. The earliest known account comes from Plato's Republic, written over 2,000 years ago, where a soldier named was left for dead on the battlefield, only to awaken days later with a vivid account of the afterlife. What has changed in modern times is not the nature of the experience, but the number of people returning to tell the tale. Before the development of advanced resuscitation techniques, clinical death was final. If someone's heart stopped, if their brain flatlined, that was the end of the story. No one came back. Now, thanks to CPR, defibrillators, and emergency medical interventions, the dead are returning, and they're bringing extraordinary stories with them. Modern medicine has unwittingly created a window into the afterlife, allowing researchers to gather thousands of detailed reports from people who have journeyed to the very edge of existence and beyond. And the numbers are staggering. It's estimated that over the past 50 years, more than 25 million people worldwide have had a near-death experience. A 1982 Gallup poll found that about 5% of the US population, millions of people, reported having an NDE. A 1998 German study found a comparable figure of 4.2%. And today, thanks to improvements in medical care, 1 in 10 people who suffer a life-threatening medical crisis, people who, in previous centuries, would have died, report some form of NDE. That means that in the last 50 years alone, tens of millions of people worldwide have reported near-death experiences. This is not a rare or fringe phenomenon. It is happening everywhere all the time to millions of people across cultures, religions, and belief systems. Let's be clear about what happens during an NDE. Most cases occur in hospital settings after a person has suffered a cardiac arrest, their heart has stopped beating, blood has ceased flowing to the brain, there is no electrical activity in the cortex, no response from the brainstem, no reflexes, no pupil dilation, no awareness, no thought. Clinically, they are dead, and yet they return. And they don't just recall vague impressions or distorted memories. No, what they describe is more vivid than ordinary waking life, more real than reality itself. They speak of an expansion of awareness, a sense of clarity and perception beyond anything they ever knew before. Time ceases to exist, space is irrelevant, and overwhelmingly, NDEers return with one unshakable conviction. Consciousness does not end with the death of the body. This realization is not an abstract philosophical idea, not a comforting belief. It is direct, first-hand knowledge. One NDEer studied by Van Lommel summed it up simply. Dead, he said, turned out to be not dead. And this is where things get even more interesting. If materialism were true, the process of dying should involve a gradual fading of consciousness, like a candle flickering out. Instead, NDEers report the opposite. They do not experience confusion or fading awareness, but instead a vastly increased clarity of mind. Experiencers describe an expansion of awareness that brings with it a feeling of release, a sense of finally being free from the limitations of the physical body. No longer bound by the restrictions of time and space, their consciousness expands, becoming clearer, sharper, more lucid than it ever was in life. And it's not just a momentary experience. The effects are permanent. The fear of death, once an ever-present shadow in their lives, evaporates. They no longer see death as an annihilation, but as a homecoming, a return to a greater reality that had always existed just beyond the veil of perception. Their minds became more vivid, more powerful, more connected than ever before. Hallucinations don't do that. Dreams don't do that. People don't wake up from hallucinations radically transformed, spending the rest of their lives convinced that reality is far more vast than they ever imagined. But near-death experiences do, and their accounts are remarkably consistent. Many describe seeing their own bodies from above, fully aware, fully present, but no longer confined to physical form. Time no longer exists in the way it does in life. Space is irrelevant. Some travel great distances instantly merely by intending to do so. Others find themselves in a world of indescribable beauty with new colors they'd never seen on Earth, where sounds are deeper and emotions are more intense than anything they had ever known. And above all, there is one message that nearly every NDEer brings back. Everything is connected. Love, compassion, and understanding are the forces that matter most in life. The timeless, spaceless dimension they describe is not an illusion. It is a deeper, more fundamental reality, one where consciousness is not merely a byproduct of neural activity, but a primary force that shapes existence itself. Following a near-death experience, people realize that everything and everybody are connected, that every thought has an impact on oneself and others, and that our consciousness survives physical death. People realize that death is not the end. Seth echoes this view, explaining that death is simply a transition, a natural movement from one state of awareness to another. Death is the personality's release from the physical field, and that is all. To the ego, this is a frightening future in prospect, but there are rather pleasant psychological experiences which are akin to the experience of death, and which would prepare the personality for this eventuality. Death is nothing more than a shift in perception, a release from the constraints of physical reality into a broader state of being. Not a finality, but a passage into a different mode of existence, one that is as natural as birth itself. To the ego, death may seem terrifying, a plunge into the unknown, but from the perspective of the broader self, it is merely a return to a larger reality, a reawakening into a world far richer and more expansive than physical life. Seth suggests that there are natural psychological experiences that mirror certain aspects of death and help prepare the personality for the transition. He may have been referring to near-death experiences themselves, as if life occasionally grants us a sneak preview of what lies beyond, a glimpse behind the curtain. Materialists like to dismiss near-death experiences as hallucinations, claims made by people whose brains are still functioning, however weakly. They argue that there must be some residual neural activity to generate the experience and to store it as a memory. But there is one problem. Some near-death experiences occur when all measurable brain activity has ceased. Take the case of Pamela Reynolds, for example. If ever there were an NDE that should not have happened under materialism, it's hers. Pamela Reynolds' near-death experience is one of the most compelling cases ever documented. A case so extraordinary that it sends materialist explanations scrambling for cover. If consciousness is merely an artifact of brain function, a flickering illusion generated by neurons, then experiences like Pam's should not exist. And yet, here we are. Let's set the stage. Pam Reynolds was a 35-year-old working mother who became seriously ill in 1991, with dizziness, loss of speech, and difficulty moving. A CAT scan revealed a large aneurysm in an artery close to her brainstem. An aneurysm is a balloon-like bulge at a weak spot on a blood vessel, and Pam's was life-threatening. If it ruptured, it would be fatal. She was referred to neurosurgeon Robert Spetzler, who decided that the only option was a radical, high-risk surgery known as hypothermic cardiac arrest, a procedure so extreme that it essentially required doctors to shut her down completely. Here's what that entailed. First, her body temperature was lowered to 10 degrees Celsius, which is 50 Fahrenheit, reducing metabolic activity and delaying cellular damage. At that temperature, the brain cells can sometimes be successfully revived after up to 60 minutes of clinical death. Next, every drop of blood was drained from her brain. Yes, you heard that right. No blood, no oxygen, nothing. At this point, Pam's EEG was completely flat, no electrical activity in the cerebral cortex or the brainstem. She was, for all intents and purposes, clinically dead. As neurosurgeon Robert Spetzler explained in The Day I Died, what we want to do is we want to bring that brain to a halt. We don't just want the brain to be asleep. We want the metabolic activity of the brain to stop. Every measurable output that the body puts out really disappears completely so that you have no measurable neuronal activity whatsoever. But just to make absolutely sure there was no chance of any brain function sneaking through, a pair of small molded speakers were placed in Pam's ears, emitting 100 decibel clicks several times per second throughout the surgery. 100 decibels is very loud. For comparison, a jet engine at takeoff is about 120 decibels. These clicks would normally trigger evoked potentials in the brainstem, a telltale sign of activity, and their absence in Pam ensured that even the deepest regions of her brain were not responding to any external stimuli during the operation. Her brain was not just inactive, it was dead. According to materialist neuroscience, this should have been lights out, total blackout, no awareness, no memory, no experience. And yet, while her brain was completely offline, Pam had one of the most vivid, detailed, and extraordinary experiences ever recorded. She later recalled that she popped out of her body and found herself looking down at the surgical team. From her vantage point, she could clearly see the doctors working on her, and later described unfamiliar medical instruments that they used during the surgery, things she had never seen in her life. But here's where things get really strange. She accurately described details of the surgery that she could not possibly have known. One moment stood out in particular. She recalled hearing a female voice saying, "We have a problem, her arteries are too small," and a male voice replying, "Try the other side." This was a conversation that actually took place. At a time when all the blood had been drained from Pam's brain, the speakers in her ears were emitting 100 decibel clicks and there were no evoked potentials in her brain stem, and yet she later repeated it word for word. The female voice she heard was that of the cardiovascular surgeon operating on her groin, not her brain, to attach her to the heart-lung machine. Upon making an incision in her right groin, she found that Pam's veins and arteries were too small. Pam later reported that this conversation confused her because she thought they were supposed to be working on her head, not her legs. This alone is extraordinary. Remember, her brain had no electrical activity whatsoever, and yet she somehow heard this conversation and repeated it word for word. This is impossible under materialist assumptions. She should not have been able to perceive anything, let alone recall it in vivid detail, but that was just the beginning. As Pam's experience deepened, she drifted away from the operating table and became aware of a presence. This marked her transition to a more profound NDE. She saw a small pinpoint of light and felt herself drawn towards it, but not against her will. She was going of her own accord because she wanted to go. The sensation, she later explained, was like the stomach-dropping feeling of going over a hill too fast. Pam described the light as brighter than anything she'd ever seen, like sitting in the middle of a glowing light bulb. But it didn't hurt to look at it. It was warm, inviting, full of life. As she entered the light, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace and belonging, and found herself surrounded by familiar faces, people she had known, people she had lost. And here's where we get to another striking parallel between NDE reports and Seth's descriptions of the afterlife. Pam noted that everyone she met in the light appeared as they had in life, but not necessarily as she last remembered them. Instead, they looked like the best version of themselves. Young, radiant, full of life and vitality. The body in the afterlife, according to Seth, is not a fixed form but a reflection of consciousness itself. It is a form you will feel comfortable in and will use when communicating with others you have known. Pam experienced something else that countless NDEers report, a form of communication that is instantaneous and non-verbal. Words were unnecessary, thoughts were transmitted directly, carrying not just their meaning but their full emotional depth. Again, this lines up exactly with Seth's descriptions of the after-death experience, where individuals communicate by direct transmission of ideas and emotions rather than spoken language. Then, just as she was beginning to fully settle into this new reality, she encountered something that nearly every NDE includes: the barrier. This invisible threshold marked the point of no return. Those who cross it never come back. Her companions informed her that if she ventured further into the light, they would be unable to return her to her body. If she went too far, something would happen physically to her body, and it would be impossible to reconnect with it. Part of her desperately wanted to stay. She hesitated. At this moment, her uncle stepped forward. He had already crossed over and was fully part of the light, but he had one last role to play. He encouraged her to go back. Pam refused. She looked down at her lifeless body on the operating table and found the sight of it deeply unappealing. It looked like an empty shell, a husk, something that no longer belonged to her. She knew that re-entering it would be painful. Her uncle didn't give up. He gently urged her, telling her to dive back in like jumping into a swimming pool. Still, she hesitated. Then, as if running out of patience, he gave her a push. In an instant, Pam was back. She slammed into her body with a force that was impossibly real, and the pain was excruciating. It was as though she had just been squeezed into something far too small, far too limiting. Later, Pam would admit that it took her a long time to forgive her uncle for pushing her back. She hadn't wanted to return. It was a struggle, and it hurt. This is another aspect of the NDE that rarely gets discussed. Many experiencers are furious at being sent back. They report a profound sense of disappointment, even anger, at having to return to the constraints of the physical body after tasting what they describe as a world of limitless freedom and love. Van Lommel's research confirmed that the after effects of an NDE are profound and long-lasting. His 10-year study of cardiac arrest survivors found that those who had an NDE became more compassionate, less materialistic, and more attuned to the emotions and needs of others. Many developed heightened intuitive abilities, including precognition and telepathy. Electronic devices frequently malfunctioned in their presence, and their fear of death, gone. NDEs are not hallucinations, they are not dying brain activity. They are something else, something that challenges everything we think we know about consciousness. And yet materialists insist that none of it is real, that consciousness must be a product of the brain, that nothing exists beyond death, that all these millions of people must be mistaken or lying. Pam's story remains one of the most well-documented and medically compelling near-death experiences ever recorded. Every measurable indication pointed to a brain that was completely shut down, and yet somehow she saw, heard, and experienced things with greater clarity than ever before. How does materialism explain this? It doesn't. Pam Reynolds' near-death experience is not just an account of what happens after death. It is a challenge to everything we think we know about consciousness, perception, and reality itself. If the brain was dead, then what was doing the seeing, hearing, and experiencing? And more importantly, what happens when we finally cross the barrier for good? Where do we go when we die? Perhaps in the end, we never really go anywhere at all. Perhaps we just wake up. In our next episode, we'll dive deeper into this phenomenon, taking a close look at the Dutch study that shook the scientific world, revealing that Pam was far from alone. Stay with us, we're just getting started. Until next time, like and subscribe, and share your views in the comments below. Thank you all for watching.